in organising this event. It's great to be here. And I want to put something out in case you're wondering where I'm from Turkey. As you know, it's a country which long tried to be a European, long tried to be a member of European Union. And you know the doors are now shut quite strongly. So growing up in Istanbul, I always wanted to be a part of the European Union. It meant quite a lot for us as growing up in Turkey. So anyway, my dreams basically come true somehow when I moved to the UK and getting a citizenship, British citizenship. But obviously these dreams are short-lived. So today I'm not going to talk about Turkey and the European Union relationships, but it's talking about European Somali families living in Birmingham. So my colleague Chris and I will be talking about our project. I want to also say we just finished the interviews last weekend, so our analysis is very at the early stages. So what is next? Where is next? Post-Brexit fears among the secondary migrant Muslim families, Somali. So we, since 2000, a considerable numbers of European Somalis moved to the UK after gaining European citizenships. So the reasons, they moved from relatively mixed cities and towns in Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, to the cities in Birmingham where there was already a concentration of Somalis and other immigrants. So many choose to come to Birmingham as it was perceived to be tolerant of cultural and religious differences. For example, one of our respondents put it that way. He says, Birmingham is so different. There are so many different people, different colors, different cultures that I don't feel different. So we have conducted 10 semi-structured interviews with secondary migrant Somali Muslim families in Birmingham. Our participants range from ages range from 16 to 43. So as their nationalities, our participants reflect the main countries of secondary migration. So they were from Finland, Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden and Norway. We had housewives, part-time care workers and business owner and also teachers. Brexit. Yeah, that's fine. Journeys, belonging and culture, I'm going to talk about this. So it's about pre-Brexit. So journeys. The reason, as I mentioned, the main reason for moving to the UK on the whole reflects the existing research, which showed the perceptions of the UK as being more tolerant to the cultural and religious differences, but more important, the expressions of those cultural and religious identities in the social and working life. So another important reason for some was that they felt that it was easier to set up business in the UK, so they somehow felt more restricted in the countries they emigrated from. Okay. So a few families also worried about their children's future in terms of career, because they felt that there was more discrimination and maybe racism because of their visible Muslim identities. Particularly, of course, you could guess, is the woman felt this way. So the UK was also seen as better for children's future career aspirations and prospects. So one of the participants says, my dad was the perception of that career was in Holland, you can only progress to a certain level, and at that point there is a glass ceiling. As someone who isn't Dutch, not white, you felt that the glass ceiling may exist in the UK, but it was a lot higher. So just to summarize very quickly, the main reasons for onward migration to Birmingham are cultural and religious tolerance and opportunities and aspirations for work and career that the UK seemed to provide for Somali migrant families. But the reasons for taking decisions were more complicated and more multi-layered. For example, some talked about the family relations, also played an important role. Having some family members already moving onwards made them think about moving and following them. Another thing was that they were seeing that considerable members of their community members were also moving onwards. So that made them also think about going to take the same decision. So they also saw the advantage of having strong established Somali communities in Birmingham and other cities in the UK. This was particularly important for some families because they were worried about their children becoming too westernized. So and that was actually talk about for both generations really. Their mum and dad and the children expressed the same worries that the parents had, and that was one of the important decisions why they made the decision to move onwards. So the reasons for onward migration, onward relocation to the UK was divided into social, cultural, and economic, as well as political. Identity and belonging? You're already there.
Yeah,
so I'm just going to very quickly talk about identity belonging, but Chris also will talk about this in terms of post-Brexit sense. So despite these shortcomings and barriers and limitations the families encountered back in the European countries they obtained citizenships, they very much talk about those countries very fondly, and they really express their gratitude and loyalty to those countries. But at the same time they saw a lot of great benefits that Birmingham and the similar cities they provided to them in terms of having a strong community and being able to express them in terms of identity, cultural and other things. In terms of the sense of home, where the home was for them obviously changed in terms of the generational terms. Some felt more strongly about being Somali, some felt more strongly about being European, and some felt British. So that's all depending on how long they lived in this country and how long they lived back in Europe and how long they lived in the Somali, obviously. Okay, so for particularly the younger generation, they felt strongly about sense of home was strongly back in where they come from in Europe. So the next quotation, I can't say that word, from a young woman who is 29-year-old, which is the very first beginning, first quotation on the screen. She's 29 years old and arrived in Birmingham when she was at the age of 15, so she lived 14 years of life in Birmingham. So she said that she refused to make any friends for 2-3 years of living in Birmingham. She didn't want to establish any strong links in Birmingham because she hoped and aspired to go back one day to Holland, because she said that her life was very beautiful there and she loved living there. And also she talked about, very interesting, she said that I didn't feel Somali, that I didn't question who I was, or I was Somali or I was Muslim. I was just a person there. But when I came here, I started to think about my Somali, because living in a big community, being part of the Somalian community meant that she had to learn the language, she had to conform to some social barriers and expectations that the whole big community obviously brought by coming here. So sense of Somalis for the young generation brought up in the European countries was less significant until they arrived into Birmingham. So it's quite ironic in a way. For some, there were many gender-based cultural, religious expectations, norms to which they needed to adapt. But at the same time, they appreciate talking about these negativities and positivities of living in the countries, and actually comparing to here was that continuously done by our participants. So it was very interesting in that way. So benefits of living in terms of in Birmingham was very much expressed by all of our participants. So. As I said, they appreciate opportunities and lives here, and they saw huge benefits of living in Birmingham and living amongst their own community. So obviously, you could imagine their sense of home, identity and belonging were very much complicated and multi-layered and also transnational. community culture. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Last thing that I'm going to talk about is, before I hand over to Chris, is community and culture, which I was already mentioned. But one of the many benefits of living in Birmingham was that as a social life, Birmingham provided, and availability of various social cultural facilities. So they felt that they were part of the city, and that which goes back to again belonging, and they enjoy having to facilities, community facilities, cultural facilities, and being able to easily access to them. So I hand over to Chris now.
Very quick.
Having said so.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about the kind of so Osman's kind of give the nice context of kind of pre-Brexit, and about the kind of a lot of the issues around the Somalis and their sense of belonging in terms of Birmingham and why they came to Birmingham. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the fears kind of post-Brexit, so after the vote last year. And so in many ways what we saw was that there was a kind of like, there was the kind of same sort of things which you would see in say non-Somali Muslim communities in the wider population. There was a kind of like there was a sense of shock that the vote had actually gone to come out of Europe. There was kind of that sense of disbelief, and then as we can see there from the bottom two quotes, is that some families actually just left straight away. So it was just like, that's it. We're not going to wait. We're not going to see how this pans out. We're just going to go straight away. So they go back to the kind of the European nation where they claimed their EU citizenship. I think as well, what you can see as well from this is that there was the kind of sense of anxiety which kind of came out, and Osman presented this kind of very accepted kind of a settled kind of view of this was where home was. And it was complex in terms, when we were trying to dig into this, it's very complex about where home was, but it was this sense that actually sort of there was the Somali communities were settled in Britain, were settled in Birmingham, and that was where they were. Their children were going to university, or they were in education, they were getting jobs. There was like all of these kind of things in terms of that. But what you saw was, with this anxiety came a challenge to this kind of complexity. So so what we saw was this, and Osman was saying this, is there's an element of Somaliness there. There's an element of Muslimness. There's an element of being Brummy, of being British, of being Dutch or Finnish, or so, and European, and so on. So there's this kind of complex web of kind of different layers of that identity. And what we see is that with Brexit vote, you see is a direct challenge to that. And I think that earlier I wrote down this thing about actually this kind of recognition that, with Brexit, that suddenly if you are a migrant, that suddenly you become a migrant again, and so there was a very clear recognition of that, and that was something, and I stole that from the first paper, it was, I'll cite you on it. But what was interesting was it was very stable. So their lives were very stable. Their lives were very settled. This was where they were seeing their future, their aspirations. Their cultural sense of belonging was there. And so what you see is that this was very much accepted and unquestioned. With Brexit, it becomes much more fractured. It becomes much more questioned. Questions begin to seep in, and you start to get this kind of sense that actually not only is their sense of belonging here in Britain being challenged, but also are their identities as well. And so whilst there was this kind of acceptance of this kind of multiplicity of different identities, suddenly some parts of those identities become more problematic, some became more prominent, and you see a kind of shift in terms of reflecting onto sort of where the kind of post-Brexit response in terms of that. What we also saw as well was the kind of re-emergence or the reinvigoration of kind of much more dormant kind of fears. And so whilst there was this kind of multiplicity of identities and multiplicity of senses of belonging as well, with this you kind of bring this back out. And as that first quote says, there was the longest time in the back of my mind, I thought I was going to go back to Sweden. You know, so it kind of, you know, and we can't tell whether that's actually what they did feel, or whether actually that was a kind of defence mechanism. It was kind of saying, oh, you know, we knew we wouldn't be able to stay. We knew we would go back to, you know, Sweden or the Netherlands or wherever. You know, so it was a kind of very interesting in the way in which this kind of pushed these kind of back towards the fore. And what you saw as well is that you saw that there was that the community, that the Somali families like felt that they were being challenged by Britain, by the UK. They felt they were being challenged by the state, but they also thought that there was a kind of challenge coming to them from the EU as well. And so, you know, so in terms of their understanding of who they are and where they are, there was very much a kind of sense that actually this was a much more of a challenge to them. There was something which was attacking in some way the kind of their identity about who they are and about where they belong and where home is and so on in terms of that. And so what you see is that you kind of, so all those points that Osman was saying in terms of like sort of why, you know, those Somali families came here in the first place suddenly become the reasons why they may not want to stay here. Or the kind of they interpret into fears about why they may have to go back somewhere else. So the kind of notion around tolerance, you know, wearing a headscarf, wearing a face veil, suddenly becomes that if they have to leave Britain, then this could be really problematic for them, and they could experience a lot more discrimination, say, elsewhere in Europe than what they do in, say, Birmingham. In terms of their aspirations as well, you know, this kind of idea is like, well, you know, actually our children have been born here and they've grown up here and they've kind of gone through the education system and they were going to go to university and they were going to go and do their jobs. Well, what about now? Where do we go in terms of this? Where do we actually kind of go in terms of it? And then you see it in a really normal kind of way. And I really like this last thing. Is that, you know, it was like going to buy a sofa in IKEA. You know, a very normal everyday activity. But all of a sudden, the awareness and the recognition that actually you may not belong anymore suddenly came to hit home in IKEA, you know, just doing those everyday kind of normal things. So, you know, so again, you see the anxiety levels beginning to come back in terms of that. And then just before I hand back to Osman, just one more here. And I include this because it illustrates the kind of complexity of identities, but it also kind of illustrates the complexity of British identities and understanding Britain for what it is in 2017. So this was from a family where it was a Somali woman and she had married a Polish convert to Islam. And then their children had been born here, and all of a sudden it's like, well, where is home? Where do we actually go? Because you know, my husband's not Somali, you know, my wife's not Polish, you know, we're both, you know, our family, our kind of roots as a family, as a unit, actually are very much in Britain, very much in Birmingham. And you know, for them, where next becomes really, really problematic because they don't have another place to go which actually brings together that kind of shared sense of identity and so on.
Just 1 minute I have, so I'll wrap it up very quickly. So that was a very interesting project, really, and it was very interesting because these families, not only their European identities are challenged, but they're obviously being a Muslim was a challenge. They were already other in that sense, and then they were also Somali heritage families, so there was issues around that, and then now being Europeanness, their Europeanness were challenged through the Brexit process. So the stories of our participants have provided important insights into their journeys to Birmingham and the pre-Brexit, post-Brexit feelings about their identities, belongings, attitudes towards the future, their place within the British society as well as Europe. So we identified 3 approaches in terms of the adaptation into this process of Brexit. The first one was, as Chris mentioned, was some families, we talk about their family members already went back. So the return to back where they obtained their citizenship was one option after the Brexit. Another one is apply for residency. So some of the participants we talked, they said that they're about to apply for residency, because obviously after the 29th of March Brexit started, so they definitely decided to take that option of residency. But that was problematic for the people who came, Somali families who came recently, because there were issues around they didn't have full-time jobs, they possibly didn't have enough time to apply for residency. So that was also problematic for some families. And so most participants we talk, they also said, well, we'll wait and see what happens. We don't know what to do. So this sense of helplessness was very prevalent for some families, particularly the housewives. The housewives with families with lots of children, or some children. So they felt like they didn't know what to do, what is next for them. So there were so many issues around that. So they're waiting and seeing what happens at the end of the 2 years. Well, that's it.
Cheers.